The period from 1941 to 1945 marks one of the darkest chapters in Philippine history. When the Imperial Japanese Army invaded and occupied our islands, it heralded an era of unimaginable fear and suffering. The promise of an Asia for the Asiatics quickly dissolved into a brutal reality of oppression. For 3 long years, the Filipino people endured a nightmare defined by violence, deprivation, and the constant threat of death. Under the watchful eye of the dreaded WWII, the Japanese military police, every Filipino was a potential suspect, and every community lived under a shadow of terror. This was not a war fought only on battlefields. It was a war waged against the very spirit of the Filipino people in their own homes and towns. Behind the grand narratives of battles and strategies lie the countless personal stories of survival and loss. The occupation was a time of immense hardship that touched every man, woman, and child. Food was scarce, leading to widespread hunger and malnutrition. Sickness was rampant, and medicine was a luxury few could afford. But beyond the physical deprivation was the constant psychological torment. Communities were torn apart by suspicion, as neighbors were forced to watch neighbors, and some were even coerced into collaborating with the occupiers. The system of zonification, where entire villages were rounded up for interrogation, created an atmosphere where no one felt safe, and the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin. It was a period that tested the limits of human endurance and resilience. The Japanese military sought to crush all forms of resistance, whether real or imagined. Suspected members of the guerrilla movement were the primary targets of their cruelty, but often the distinction between a fighter and an innocent civilian was completely ignored. Entire villages could face collective punishment for the actions of a few. The goal was to instill absolute obedience through fear, and the methods used were systematically brutal. This was a calculated campaign of terror designed to break the will of a nation. The stories from this time are not just historical accounts. They are harrowing testimonies of the horrors that human beings can inflict upon one another in the name of conquest and control. The suffering was not confined to a single group, it was a shared national trauma. From the soldiers who endured the infamous Bataan Death March, to the ordinary farmers and vendors who faced daily threats, the pain was widespread. Children witnessed atrocities that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Families were broken, with members lost to executions, massacres, or forced labor. The scars left by the Japanese occupation were deep and profound, affecting not just the generation that lived through it but also the succeeding ones. Understanding this period requires us to look beyond the dates and events and listen to the silent screams of the victims, whose stories form a critical, albeit painful, part of our national memory. The brutality of the Japanese occupation was most evident in the systematic use of torture. The methods employed by the WWII were designed not just to extract information, but to inflict maximum pain and dehumanize their victims. One of the most notorious techniques was water torture. Victims were forced to lie on their backs while large quantities of water were funneled into their mouths and noses through a hose. Their stomachs would swell to a painful, drum-like state. Interrogators would then jump on or beat their bloated abdomens, causing internal injuries and forcing the water out in a violent expulsion. This agonizing process was often repeated until the victim confessed, passed out, or died, leaving survivors with permanent physical and psychological trauma. Physical beatings were a common and relentless form of punishment. Victims were tied up and mercilessly struck with a variety of implements, including wooden sticks, metal rods, and leather belts. The beatings were not random, they were often targeted at specific parts of the body to cause prolonged agony. Another horrific method involved burning. Interrogators would use heated metal rods, lit cigarettes, or open flames to scorch the victim's skin, leaving behind a map of excruciating burns. In some cases, prisoners were subjected to electric shocks, with wires attached to the most sensitive parts of their bodies, sending jolting currents of pain that convulsed their entire being. These methods were a testament to the calculated cruelty of the regime. The bayonet, a standard-issue weapon for Japanese soldiers, was frequently turned into an instrument of torture and execution. Suspected guerrillas and even civilians who failed to bow properly could be stabbed, slashed, or disemboweled. The Bataan Death March became infamous for these acts, where soldiers who faltered from exhaustion were summarily bayoneted or beheaded with swords. Beyond these direct physical assaults, Filipinos were subjected to grueling forced labor. Many were conscripted to build airfields, fortifications, and other military infrastructure under inhumane conditions. They were given little food or water and worked to the point of collapse, with those who refused or could not continue facing immediate and fatal punishment. Perhaps the most insidious form of torture was psychological. The Japanese military excelled at breaking the human spirit. In some documented cases, Filipino prisoners were forced to commit horrific acts against their fellow countrymen to prove their loyalty or to save their own lives. Refusing such an order would result in their own torture and execution. This tactic sowed deep mistrust and paranoia within communities, turning friends and neighbors against one another. The goal was to destroy the social fabric and the moral compass of the people, leaving them isolated and broken. The invisible wounds left by this psychological warfare were often as deep and lasting as the physical scars. Among the most heinous crimes committed during the Japanese occupation was the systematic sexual violence perpetrated against Filipino women and girls. This dark aspect of the war was not a series of isolated incidents but a widespread and organized military policy. Countless women were subjected to rape, often in front of their families, as a tool of terror and subjugation. Beyond these brutal assaults, the Japanese military established a system of sexual slavery, creating what they euphemistically called comfort stations. These were, in reality, military rape camps where women were imprisoned and forced to serve the sexual demands of Japanese soldiers. These women, who came to be known as comfort women, were victims in the purest sense of the word. It must be stated clearly and unequivocally, these women were not prostitutes. They were innocent civilians who were abducted from their homes, taken from the streets, or lured with false promises of work. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers who found themselves trapped in a living nightmare. Once inside the comfort stations, they were stripped of their names, their identities, and their humanity. They were held captive and repeatedly violated by dozens of soldiers each day. Resistance or refusal to comply was met with extreme violence, including severe beatings, torture, or even death. Their families were also threatened, leaving the women with no choice but to submit to the horrific demands of their captors. The fear and coercion were absolute. These women were forced to obey under the constant threat of death. They were not complicit. They were prisoners of war, subjected to a unique and gendered form of brutality. Their ordeal was a crime against humanity, a gross violation of their dignity and their rights. The trauma they endured was profound, leaving them with deep physical, emotional, and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. For decades after the war, many survivors, known as Lolas, grandmothers, carried their secret in silence, burdened by a misplaced sense of shame and the stigma that society often attaches to victims of sexual violence. Their silence was a testament to the depth of their pain. The story of the comfort women is a crucial and painful part of our history that demands to be told. Recognizing their innocence is fundamental to honoring their memory and their struggle for justice. They were not at fault. The blame lies solely with their perpetrators and the military system that orchestrated these atrocities. Acknowledging their suffering is not about reopening old wounds, but about giving a voice to the voiceless and ensuring that their tragic experience is integrated into our national consciousness. They were victims of a brutal war, and their story is a stark reminder of the horrific consequences when human dignity is stripped away by the powerful. The atrocities of the Japanese occupation left an indelible scar on the Filipino nation. The impact was felt by everyone, from the elderly who lost their children, to the children who were orphaned by violence. Men and women, young and old, were subjected to a level of cruelty that shattered their sense of safety and community. The physical destruction of cities like Manila was immense, but the damage to the collective psyche of the people was even greater. The war did not just end in 1945, its echoes have reverberated through generations. The trauma experienced by the survivors was often passed down, manifesting as a deep-seated caution, a lingering sorrow, and a painful memory that shaped family histories and community narratives for decades to come. Remembering these dark times is not an act of dwelling on the past, or fostering hatred. It is a necessary act of justice for the victims. By recalling the horrors of the water torture, the beatings, the forced labor, and the sexual slavery of the comfort women, we give a name to their suffering and validate their experiences. We honor the sacrifice of the nearly 1 million Filipinos who perished during this period. Forgetting their stories would be a second injustice, erasing their existence from our historical memory. Their pain and resilience must be acknowledged, studied, and remembered as a testament to the strength of the Filipino spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. It is our duty to ensure that their voices are never silenced by the passage of time. Furthermore, studying this history provides critical lessons for the present and the future. It serves as a powerful warning against the dangers of unchecked militarism, imperialism, and racial prejudice. When we understand how a society can descend into such barbarity, we become more vigilant in safeguarding our own freedoms and human rights. The stories of the Kempe Tai and the comfort stations remind us that atrocities are not abstract events. They are committed by ordinary people who have been indoctrinated by a dehumanizing ideology. This history teaches us to be critical of power, to stand up against injustice, and to champion the cause of human dignity at all costs, both at home and abroad. Ultimately, remembering the sacrifices of our ancestors is essential to our identity as a nation. It is a solemn promise that we will never allow such horrors to be repeated on our soil. By educating our youth about this painful chapter, we equip them with the historical consciousness needed to prevent future atrocities. We teach them empathy, the importance of peace, and the courage to speak out against violence and oppression. The memory of World War II in the Philippines is a sacred trust. It is a painful but vital inheritance that reminds us of the price of our freedom and the enduring need to build a world where such cruelty has no place.